Hello, everyone. Let's talk about slavery. Slavery is one of those things, very much like capitalism, which is as old as human civilization. Slavery has been a characteristic of human society, um, again, from the very start. Now, um, what we've had, however, and this is an important point to understand, um, we have slavery that has uh, existed throughout most of human history. Um, and then we've had the kind of slavery that develops in the Americas. And that comes after the period of colonies being established by Portugal, Spain, France, as well as Great Britain. Okay? And the slavery that develops in the Americas in the later period of human history is distinctly different than slavery as it has existed throughout most of human history. And so, what I'll be doing to try to keep it straight is I'll be first focusing on what is considered to be classical slavery. And this is slavery as it existed in its original appearance and as it existed throughout most of human history. Okay? Now, there are several distinctions that I want to highlight. And so let me start with the first. First, classical slavery was not in any way, shape, or form classical slavery was not in any way, shape, or form connected to race. What you'll find is slavery throughout most of human history was a community based institution, a family based institution. So the idea then is that those who were slaves within a particular society were drawn from that community. And what is the basic definition of what it meant throughout most of human history to be a slave is that you were not paid money for the work that you did. And then this meant that slavery was overwhelmingly an urban institution, which then meant, again, you're going to find that the largest percentage of slaves lived in cities. And throughout most of human history, the vast majority of the population lived outside of cities. And so it was only in cities that you had economic activities that required slavery. And so, for example, you had businesses that were, for example, tanneries that would take the skins from animals and turn that skin into leather. That was an enterprise that was urban based, that required labor. And of course, they utilized slave labor because there wasn't enough money. So, again, the driving force behind slavery as it has existed throughout most of human history is the simple fact that there was not sufficient coin to pay labor in money. And so what happens then is those who were slaves were compensated, but they were compensated in the form of things. So, for example, slaves were provided shelter, they were provided clothing and food. And so those were the main things that a person would need money for in the first place. And again, this was not a choice. when you understand throughout most of human history, the only thing that was recognized as money was gold or silver coin, there was not enough gold or silver coin in the world to pay labor. So gold and silver coin was limited in terms of paying for the transportation of goods, paying for the purchase of goods. Okay? So there was simply not enough coin available to pay labor in coin. Okay? So that's what we're dealing with. And again, we're dealing in a situation where most people provided for themselves. In other words, they spent their lives raising their own crops, raising their own livestock, and providing for themselves. So again, they didn't need coin because they were providing the things they needed themselves. Okay? And so, slavery was not based on race. There was no connection at all in any way between slavery and a person's skin color. Now, second, under Okay. So again, under classical slavery, slaves did not necessarily hold the lowest station in society. And so again, there were a lot of different jobs that required different levels of skill. That again was performed by slave labor because again there wasn't sufficient coin to pay them in money. And so the idea then is that all labor throughout most of human history was slave labor. And as a result of this, you will have some slaves that were low skilled, no skilled, and those who were highly skilled. And all of those, from the lowest skilled to the highest skilled, and everyone in between, were slaves, and they too were compensated in the form of food, clothing, and shelter. And very much like today, the quality of the food, clothing, and shelter they received was dependent upon their skill. So again, if you were a low skill, no skill slave, then the quality of your food, the quality of your shelter, the quality of your clothing would be on the low end as well. For those who are highly skilled, well then the quality of their food, their clothing, their shelter would be, again, at the level of their skill. And so, for example, in today's world, there are a lot of highly paid professional positions that were handled by slaves throughout most of human history. So, for example, architects. The architects who built the temples and statues honoring the ancient Egyptian pharaohs were slaves. And as the archaeological evidence indicates, as they've uncovered near the areas where these temples exist, where these temples can still be seen, there were the architect's village. And the architects who lived in these areas were, again, slaves, but they were living very comfortably, as indicated by the floor plans that have been uncovered of their homes and other evidence and descriptions. They were fed very well. They were clothed well. They lived comfortably because they were performing a vital function within Egyptian society. They were building temples to honor Pharaoh, a living god. Okay? You had, again, throughout most of human history, physicians were slaves. Again, you did not have the kind of system we see today when it comes to medicine, where you have the doctor's office and where when you're sick, you go to the doctor. Okay? No. A family provided their own medical care, which meant it was, again, exclusively available to the wealthy. You would seek somebody. The head of a wealthy family would seek somebody out who was skilled in the medical arts. And then they would bring them into their home, where they would then provide the person who would become literally the family doctor a place to live, clothes to wear, food to eat, a space to work, as well as all of the materials they would need to do their job. And so then, once this was set up, then if there was a member of the family who felt ill, they would literally go to the family doctor, who would then diagnose them and treat them. And that's how families provided for their own health care. Again, this would be something that was exclusively done by the wealthiest people, because only they could afford these kinds of arrangements. Most other humans, again, they handled their own illnesses according to locally understood, locally recognized remedies. But again, for those who were the wealthiest, those who worked as the physicians, the doctors, for the wealthiest were legally classified as slaves, as were teachers. Again, you did not have a system of public education like that we see today in the United States. Again, throughout most of human history, those who could afford to educate their children would have to provide that service for their own family. So again, you would seek somebody who was skilled as a teacher. You would bring that person into your home. You would provide them a place to live, a place to sleep, food to eat, clothes to wear, a place to work, and all of the materials they would need to do their job. And so the idea then is the teacher would be part of the extended household. The doctor would be part of the extended household. And that then what this do is it creates the scenario in which a particular room in the house is dedicated as the schoolroom. And so then the children within that household would go on a daily basis to the schoolroom, where they would receive instruction from the teacher. Now, for those slaves who were the doctors and the teachers for these elite households, they socialized with the family. They interacted with the family. They were not treated as a degraded element of the population. These were people to respect. They were providing a vital service. And you would have to trust these people to do the job that you needed them to do. Because again, especially when it came to someone who was working as a physician, you would have to be able to trust them implicitly, because at one point or another, you're going to be sitting before that doctor, and they're going to be doing something like handing you something and say, take this. And you're going to have to be able to trust them without question. And if you're brutalizing that person, if you're humiliating that person, if you're degrading that person, then you're not going to have that kind of relationship you need. Take a story that some of you may be familiar with from the Old Testament, the story of Joseph, taken by his brothers and sold into slavery in Egypt. And he becomes an advisor to Pharaoh. Joseph was a slave. But he was a slave within Pharaoh's house. And if you were a slave within Pharaoh's house, you lived very well. You ate very well. And so Joseph, as a slave within Pharaoh's house, lived more comfortably, dressed better, and ate better than the vast majority of free Egyptians. So again, simply because you were a slave, that did not mean automatically that you were among the lowest members of the society, people at the bottom of the social scale. Okay? As a slave, where your position was depended on your level of skill. And that, again, is very much like today. Today, you have people who are low-skilled and no-skilled, and they don't get paid very much, which then affects the quality of the food they can afford to purchase, the quality of the clothing they can afford to purchase, the quality of the shelter that they can afford to purchase or rent. And we have people who are highly skilled, who get paid significantly more, which then means they can afford better food, better clothing, and better shelter. So that aspect regarding labor throughout the whole of human history, including the present, hasn't changed. Okay? What will allow for slavery to end is the ability to print money, the technology to print money. And then that creates a significantly larger supply of money. When money was limited to gold or silver coin, it was extremely limited. But when you get to the point where we're printing money, we have a significantly larger money supply, then money can begin to be used to pay labor, to pay people for the work they do. And that ability to print paper money on the scale necessary to bring slavery to an end was not reached until the mid-1800s. And that's when you begin to see slavery coming to an end. Okay? Third, under Under classical slavery, being enslaved was not necessarily a permanent condition. So, for example, there were numerous examples throughout human history where a person who was deeply in debt, who was at a point where they could no longer pay their debts, that person might choose to sell themselves into slavery. And the way they may do that is they would first seek out a wealthy patron who would be willing to pay off all their debts. And then, once that was done, that person would become the slave of that wealthy patron who paid off all their debts. Now, again, anyone who made this kind of arrangement, it was not a permanent arrangement. So the idea then is the laws as they were written affecting this kind of procedure, depending on the amount of money paid, would determine the length of time that the person was enslaved. So if it was at this amount or lower, then you would be enslaved at most for 4 years. If it was at this amount or higher, then the longest period of time you could be enslaved was 7 years. So again, depending on the amount of debt the wealthy patron paid off, you would be their slave for either 4 years, but no more than 7. And then at the end of that length of time, you would no longer be a slave and you would be debt-free as well, because all your debts were paid. Now, another common practice within human society has been to enslave criminals. Again, the idea of a penitentiary where you house prisoners, which then allows for you to sentence them to prison for a specified length of time, depending upon the nature of the crime that they were convicted of. Then they could go to that penitentiary, serve their sentence, and then leave. That hasn't been around since, again, the mid-1800s. So, as I mentioned earlier, for the vast majority of crimes, you were either punished by execution or you were branded. But there were quite a few crimes in between that were still serious crimes that were worthy of punishment, but not worthy of execution. Those crimes did not rise to that level. They didn't even rise to the level of being mutilated, being branded, but punishment was still required. And so what becomes a common form of punishment is enslavement. And you would literally become a slave within the community for a specified length of time. And when after that length of time had elapsed, then you would no longer be a slave. So, again, this was something that would affect the person who was convicted of the crime, not their family. As you may have heard the old adage, you do not punish the children for the sins of the father. So again, it was limited to a punishment for crime. Now, again, in some areas, depending on the situation, what you do find as a significant element of the criminal population punished by enslavement would be prisoners of war. And these would be the prisoners that you would have, the slaves that you would have to watch carefully, because they they belonged in another community. They lived elsewhere, but they were being forcibly held in this community as captured prisoners of war. And of course, you would punish them. You would want to punish them severely. The idea then is normally these would be criminals who would be worthy of execution. But the attitude in this scenario, and again, it would depend on the level of complexity within that society. But what you would do is if there was the option. For example, if there were mines in that community that needed to be worked, quarries that needed to be worked. These are areas where you would have some of the most physically demanding work you could imagine. And you would put these slaves to work in the mines, to work in the quarries as their punishment. And again, because they were being put to work in these very difficult conditions, very dangerous conditions, because, again, certainly in the case of prisoners of war, they were being forcibly held. These are the ones that you would need the overseers for, to make sure they were working, cracking the whip. These would be the slaves who were limited with the amount of water they could drink, because you wanted them to hurt. You wanted them to feel pain, because this was punishment. These are the ones who would need to be locked up at night, because if you didn't, they would escape. They would run away. And again, those characteristics of slavery were limited to those who were the most violent individuals, who were considered a threat. Again, sometimes they would just be executed, if, again, that was the most efficient way. But for these areas where you had mines and quarries, the attitude was, why just kill them outright? Why not work them to death? And then we'll at least get maybe 6 months of labor out of them, maybe a year. But for these individuals, their enslavement would likely become a permanent condition, that they would be enslaved for the rest of their life. But the length of their lifespan after their enslavement would be limited because of the brutal conditions under which they were forced to live. This is not how you would treat the slaves working in a tannery. This is not how you would treat slaves working for the Pharaoh as architects, or as advisors to Pharaoh, or as doctors and teachers within private households. Okay? Now, one last characterization in this, I've kind of touched on this. That throughout, under classical slavery, slavery was a household institution. In other words, this is how households provided essential services for themselves. Today, a lot of these essential services that I'm talking about, we pay for through our taxes. And so it's our taxes that provide us access to medical care, as well as our insurance. It's our taxes that allow for the existence of public schools. Okay? But again, throughout most of human history, this kind of taxpayer-funded services simply didn't exist. So if you were of that wealthy elite, the way that you would provide the services you needed was by bringing in slaves to your household. What happens with slavery as it develops in the Americas is slavery in the Americas becomes caught up, a part of a capitalistic, highly competitive, highly profitable plantation system. And this kind of environment creates a vast distance between the slaveholder and the slaves. You did not have that kind of distance when you're talking about a slave working as a family physician, a slave working as a teacher within the household. Again, that the relationship, the degree of interaction was much more direct. And so slavery as it develops in the Americas becomes distinctly different. And so that's what I want us to turn our attention to. So again, what I've been describing so far is classical slavery. The kind of slavery that develops in the Americas following the establishment of the colonies of the sugar plantations in places like Brazil, the Caribbean, the plantations of North America, the rice plantations, the tobacco plantations. What you have in that scenario is what's called chattel slavery. And under chattel slavery, what happens is a fundamental shift. There is a fundamental change. Chattel is an old word. It's a word no longer used. But chattel means property. And under chattel slavery, the slaves themselves become property. They become legally identified as property under the law. The human person who is then designated a slave is literally then owned by the slave holder. Okay? And that is completely different in relation to slavery as it has existed throughout most of human history. Throughout most of human history, and this is going to sound much more complicated than it really is, but just think about it. What I've been describing throughout most of human history is those who utilized slaves, they owned the slave's labor, not the slave, but they owned the slave's labor. So again, what that meant is in exchange for the food, the clothing, the shelter, they would do the work required of them. Then if they chose not to, or if they were not doing the job in a way that was suitable, then they would lose their compensation of food, shelter, and clothing and have to seek out another position. So again, it wasn't throughout most of human history under classical slavery, the person who was the slave was not owned, only their labor. And that still is what we have in today's world. The difference is, of course, today we're paid in money. But if you're working as a cashier for HEB, and then you are scheduled to be in at work at 2 o'clock in the afternoon and work until 8 o'clock tonight, well then you have to be there. You don't have a choice. And when you go in at 2 o'clock and the front end manager hands you a till and says, open up register 7, well then that's what you have to do. because the agreement that you've made is in exchange for the money that HEB pays you, you have to do what HEB has hired you to do. Okay? And so, again, if you are working for HEB or some other employer, then again, in relation to the way that you can understand the situation is to recognize that in exchange for the money that HEB is paying you, they own your labor when you're scheduled to work. Now, again, your labor is defined by your job description. Okay? So here's the thing. Maybe you come into work and the front end is slow, but 3 guys in dairy had called in sick and the shelves are empty. So maybe the front end manager says something like, well, we don't need you up front right now, but we need you to stock some milk. Now, again, that's not your job. You were hired as a cashier, not as a stocker. Now, as in all seriousness, under the law, you certainly can say yes and go stock some milk. But you can also say no. And they can't fire you for that. Because you weren't hired to stock dairy. You were hired to work as a cashier. And so maybe you have a bad back, which would be hurt, damaged, if you were to be lugging those plastic crates full of milk. And that's why you didn't apply to work as a stocker. So, again, the limitations, just like, again, if a slave was hired as a physician in one of those elite households, you wouldn't put them to work washing the dishes after dinner. That was not their job. Their job was to treat you and members of your extended family when ill. That was their job. Okay? So the idea then again is the front end manager can't say when you go into work, well, the front end's really slow. We don't need any more registers open, but go pick up my dry cleaning. No. Or we don't need you on the front end, but go mow my lawn. No. Because HEB does not own you. They own your labor as defined by your job description. Okay? So that is actually something in common that has persisted. Another example, let me just go back to it now that I mention it. Again, the idea of the enslavement as a punishment for crime. We still have that too. But again, today we have a lot of different punishments that means, again, we don't have to have so many people punished by execution or branding. But there are still crimes today that are worthy of punishment, but they're not worthy of execution. They're not worthy of even imprisonment. And for those crimes of that level, a punishment that you may recognize is called community service. That's a nice way to put it. But so let's say as your punishment, you have to pick up litter in the city park from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. every Saturday for the next year. Okay. So what are you? From 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. every Saturday for the next year. You are a slave. You don't have a choice because this is your punishment. You're certainly not getting paid. And you better be there at 10 o'clock. And you better stay until 4 o'clock. Otherwise, they will put you in prison. Because that is your punishment. And if you agree to the terms of community service, then that is how you can keep yourself out of prison. Again, for those individuals in different communities throughout human history who sold themselves into slavery as a way of paying off their debts. Although debt laws have changed over the last several years, for a very long time before those changes were made, if you declared bankruptcy, which meant you were so deeply in debt, you are going to court acknowledging that you will never be able to pay those debts. Never, ever, ever. And so once that declaration was made in court, then the court would basically cancel out your debt. And the letters would go out to the creditors that you owed money to. They'll just have to write that debt off. They're never going to get a penny back from you. You've declared bankruptcy. Now, once you did that, you effectively had a 0 credit rating. And if you know anything, if you have a credit rating that's too low and you can't get much lower than 0, there's a lot you can't do. You can't buy a car. You can't even rent in many areas a place to live. A lot of jobs will check your credit rating. And if your credit rating is too low, then they will make the conclusion that you can't be trusted in a position with this level of responsibility. So it limits how many jobs you could get. And what the law stipulated was the length of time, the maximum length of time in which you would be under those conditions. 7 years. Now, when those modern bankruptcy laws were written, do you think they just plucked the 7-year limit just out of thin air? No. Because going back throughout human history, the maximum length of time a person could be enslaved for debt, 7 years. And so again, when you're talking about an institution that is as old as classical slavery, it still echoes. It still resonates in our own time. But again, chattel slavery becomes a system of slavery that completely alters, completely changes the connection between slave and slaveholder. It's under chattel slavery that you have slave holders, slave owners. That is not a characteristic of slavery as it has existed throughout most of human history. Okay? But chattel slavery, where the law is changed to define the slave themselves as property that is literally owned by the slave owner, that, again, is fundamentally different. And that is what represents a again, significant change where the nature of slavery as chattel slavery is evil. And so let's talk about why was this change brought about. Again, the intent wasn't to oppress. Okay? That wasn't the intent behind the decision to define slaves as property. What was behind the intent was to protect your investment. Slavery is expensive. When you start buying and selling people, well, we come with a pretty high price tag. And what we are dealing with then is a scenario in which the source of slaves is West Africa. But those West Africans are needed to work in Brazil, in Bermuda, the Bahamas, Cuba, Central America, North America. And so they are then transported across varying distances, but up to 3,000 miles away from their point of origin. And they're being transported across the deep ocean. And somebody who is engaging in the slave trade, where they're now transporting slaves across the Atlantic Ocean, storms could come up, rogue waves, any number of situations could occur that could wipe